December 7th, 1941. 07:55 hours. Pearl Harbor, Oahu, Hawaii Territory. The first bombs fell like steel rain from a sky that had been clear and peaceful moments before. Through the smoke and chaos, as American sailors scrambled from burning ships and aircraft exploded on runways still wet with morning dew, a different kind of devastation was being calculated in the wardrooms of the Imperial Japanese Navy. 6 aircraft carriers, operating 275 miles north of Oahu, had just demonstrated what naval power would mean in the modern age. Not the thunder of 16-inch guns from battleships, but waves of aircraft launched from floating runways that could strike from beyond the horizon. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of his flagship Akagi, watching his strike aircraft return through the morning haze. Around him, his staff officers spoke in hushed, almost reverent tones. They had just accomplished what many Western naval theorists had said was impossible. A carrier strike force had crossed 3,400 miles of open ocean undetected, launched 353 aircraft in 2 waves, and crippled the United States Pacific Fleet in less than 2 hours. 8 battleships damaged or destroyed, 188 aircraft obliterated on the ground, 2,403 Americans dead. Japanese losses: 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines, 64 men. The mathematics seemed to prove everything the Imperial Navy had believed about carrier warfare. While American admirals had poured resources into battleships, believing that naval supremacy still belonged to the biggest guns and thickest armor, Japan had built a carrier force that could project power across thousands of miles of ocean. The attack on Pearl Harbor wasn't just a tactical victory. It was validation of an entire naval philosophy that the West had dismissed as experimental, even frivolous. What Nagumo and his officers didn't know, what none of the Japanese naval commanders celebrating in the wardrooms of the Kido Butai that morning could have imagined, was that they had just awakened an industrial colossus whose response would redefine naval warfare forever. Within 3 years, the 6 carriers that launched the Pearl Harbor strike would lie on the ocean floor. Within 4 years, American carriers would be launching strikes against the Japanese home islands with impunity, their aircraft blackening the sky in numbers the Imperial Navy had never conceived possible. The admirals who had laughed at America's floating airfields, who had dismissed carrier warfare as something only Japan truly understood, would watch their doctrine, their navy and their empire burn under attacks launched from the very weapons they had once mocked. The ocean was about to change its masters, and the instrument of that change would be written in the riveted steel hulls of carriers built faster than Japan could sink them. This is the story of how confidence became hubris, how laughter turned to silence, and how the nation that perfected carrier warfare in 1941 was destroyed by it in 1945. The seeds of Japanese naval aviation dominance were planted in the ruins of World War I, while European powers emerged from that conflict believing the battleship remained the capital ship of any serious navy. A handful of naval theorists in Japan, Britain, and the United States began exploring a radical concept. What if naval power could be projected not by guns with a 20-mile range, but by aircraft that could strike hundreds of miles from their launching point? The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, designed to prevent an arms race in capital ships, inadvertently accelerated carrier development. With battleship construction limited by international agreement, major naval powers turned to carriers as a way to expand their fleets without technically violating treaty terms. Japan converted the battlecruiser hulls Akagi and Kaga into aircraft carriers, creating platforms that could launch devastating airstrikes while remaining within treaty limitations. By the mid-1930s, the Imperial Japanese Navy had developed a carrier doctrine more sophisticated than any other nation possessed. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had studied at Harvard and served as naval attaché in Washington, understood both the potential of carrier aviation and the industrial capacity of the United States. His assessment was brutally realistic. Japan could win a short war against America through superior training, tactics, and the element of surprise. A long war against American industrial might would be unwinnable. This understanding shaped Japanese carrier development. The Kido Butai, the first air fleet, became the most powerful carrier strike force in the world. 6 fleet carriers operating as a unified task force, capable of launching over 400 aircraft in coordinated strikes. Japanese naval aviators trained for years, with pilot training programs that were among the most demanding in the world. By 1941, the average Japanese carrier pilot had over 800 hours of flight time and years of combat experience from the war in China. American carrier development followed a different path. The US Navy had pioneered carrier operations with USS Langley in 1922, but institutional resistance from battleship admirals slowed carrier procurement. By 1941, the Pacific Fleet had only 3 fleet carriers: Lexington, Saratoga, and Enterprise. 2 more, Yorktown and Hornet, operated in the Atlantic. American naval doctrine still centered on the battle line, the formation of battleships that would engage enemy fleets in decisive gun duels reminiscent of Jutland. Japanese naval officers observing American carrier operations in the late 1930s reported with barely concealed amusement. American carriers operated independently or in pairs, not as a concentrated striking force. American naval aviators were competent but lacked combat experience. Most damning, American carriers were seen as support vessels for the battle fleet, not as weapons capable of independent strategic operations. Admiral Nagumo himself had expressed skepticism about carrier warfare. A torpedo and gunnery specialist who had risen through the surface warfare community, he had been given command of the Kido Butai, partly because he was considered cautious and methodical. The aggressive carrier admirals like Yamaguchi preferred faster, riskier operations. Nagumo's appointment reflected the Japanese Navy's own internal debate about the role of carriers. Were they truly the future of naval warfare? Or were they auxiliary forces that would soften up enemy fleets before the battleships delivered the decisive blow? Pearl Harbor answered that question with catastrophic clarity. The attack demonstrated that carriers could be the decisive weapon, that air power could cripple a fleet before surface ships even made contact. But it also revealed a critical flaw in Japanese strategic thinking. The attack destroyed battleships but missed the American carriers, which were at sea during the attack. More significantly, it left the fuel storage facilities, repair yards, and submarine base intact. Nagumo had achieved a tactical masterpiece while missing the strategic targets that would have crippled American ability to wage war in the Pacific. In the months following Pearl Harbor, Japanese carriers rampaged across the Pacific with impunity. They struck Rabaul, supported the invasion of the Dutch East Indies, raided into the Indian Ocean, sinking British carriers and cruisers with contemptuous ease. Every operation reinforced Japanese confidence. The Kido Butai seemed invincible, a weapon that could strike anywhere and overwhelm any opposition. American carriers, operating cautiously and defensively, launched limited raids against Japanese positions in the Marshall Islands and Marcus Island. These pinprick attacks accomplished little militarily, but provided American carrier crews with desperately needed combat experience. More importantly, they began revealing the vulnerabilities of Japanese doctrine that would prove fatal. The first hint of American adaptability came in April 1942 with the Doolittle raid. 16 B-25 bombers launched from USS Hornet struck Tokyo and other Japanese cities in a raid that seemed impossible. Medium bombers operating from a carrier, flying a one-way mission that defied conventional carrier doctrine. The raid caused minimal physical damage, but profound psychological impact. Japan's home islands were vulnerable. The American Navy, supposedly crippled and defeated, was capable of striking the heart of the empire. Admiral Yamamoto, alarmed by the raid, accelerated plans for Operation MY, the invasion of Midway Island. By capturing this tiny atoll 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii, Japan would extend its defensive perimeter and, more importantly, draw out the remaining American carriers for a decisive battle. The Kido Butai would destroy the American carrier force, securing Japanese dominance in the Pacific for years. What Yamamoto didn't know was that American cryptographers had broken the Japanese naval code. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Haipo in Hawaii had been reading Japanese naval communications for weeks, piecing together details of the Midway operation. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, knew where the Japanese would strike, when they would strike, and with what forces. The intelligence advantage allowed Nimitz to position his 3 available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, northeast of Midway, perfectly positioned to ambush the Japanese strike force. The American carriers would operate under severe disadvantages. They had 233 aircraft, compared to the Japanese 248. American torpedo bombers were obsolete, slow, and vulnerable. American dive bombers lacked the range and bomb load of their Japanese counterparts. But the Americans held the decisive advantage of knowing exactly where their enemy would be. June 4th, 1942, 0430 hours. The waters 250 miles northwest of Midway Island. Vice Admiral Nagumo's 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, launched their first strike against Midway. 108 aircraft, bombers and fighters thundered off the flight decks in the pre-dawn darkness. Nagumo held back a reserve strike force, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, ready to launch against American carriers if they appeared. At 0520, a Japanese search plane reported sighting American ships, but didn't identify carriers. Nagumo faced a decision. His Midway strike force was reporting that a second attack would be needed to suppress the island's defenses. His reserve strike aircraft were armed for anti-ship attacks. Should he rearm them with land attack bombs for a second Midway strike, or hold them in reserve for a possible carrier engagement? Nagumo made the fateful decision to rearm for a second land strike. On the hangar decks of 4 Japanese carriers, ordnance crews began the laborious process of removing torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, replacing them with high-explosive bombs and incendiary weapons. Torpedoes and bombs were stacked on the hangar decks, gasoline lines were opened for refueling, and ammunition was moved into position. At 0820, a Japanese scout finally confirmed what Nagumo feared. American carriers, at least 1, possibly 2, were operating northeast of his position. He immediately ordered his aircraft rearmed again, back to anti-ship weapons. The hangar decks became scenes of organized chaos as crews frantically reversed their work, surrounded by fuel, bombs, and torpedoes, in a deadly tableau of confusion. The American carriers, guided by Rochefort's intelligence, had launched their strikes at maximum range. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet arrived first. 15 obsolete TBD Devastator torpedo bombers flying low and slow toward the Japanese carriers. Without fighter escort, they were massacred. 0 fighters fell on them like hawks on sparrows. 13 of 15 aircraft were shot down. Not a single torpedo hit. Minutes later, Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise arrived. Same result, 10 of 14 aircraft destroyed. No hits. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown, 14 aircraft, attacked, 12 shot down, no hits. In 45 minutes, American torpedo squadrons had been virtually annihilated. 41 aircraft launched, 5 returned, no damage to the Japanese carriers, to the Japanese fighter pilots, to the anti-aircraft crews. To Admiral Nagumo himself, it seemed like confirmation of Japanese superiority. The Americans were brave but hopelessly outmatched. What none of them realized was that the torpedo attacks, suicidal as they were, had pulled Japanese fighter cover down to wave-top level. The combat air patrol of Zeros was at sea level, chasing the last torpedo bombers, when American dive bombers arrived at 15,000 feet. At 10:20 hours, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading 33 dive bombers from Enterprise, spotted the Japanese carriers below. 4 carriers in a rectangular formation, turning into the wind to launch aircraft. Their flight decks crowded with fully fueled, fully armed aircraft. The hangar decks packed with ordnance. The scene was perfect for what would happen next. McCluskey split his force. Half would attack Kaga, half would attack Akagi. As the American dive bombers rolled into their attacks, Japanese lookouts finally spotted them. Too late. No fighters at altitude, no time to maneuver. At 10:22, 3 1,000-pound bombs struck Kaga in rapid succession. The first bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar, detonating stored torpedoes and fuel. The second bomb hit near the island's superstructure, killing most of the ship's senior officers. The third bomb struck aft, igniting fully fueled aircraft spotted for launch. Within minutes, Kaga was a floating inferno. Seconds later, dive bombers from Yorktown, arriving by coincidence at the same moment as McCluskey's aircraft, attacked Soryu. 3 direct hits, same devastating effect. Explosions in the hangar bay, fires racing through the ship, secondary explosions as ordnance cooked off. McCluskey's remaining dive bombers struck Akagi. 1 bomb, perhaps 2, hit Nagumo's flagship. The bombs penetrated to the hangar deck, where they ignited the ordnance that had been moved there during the chaotic, rearming process. Akagi, the ship that had launched the Pearl Harbor strike, began dying in flames that her crew could not control. In 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 6 fleet carriers were reduced to burning wrecks. The ships that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months, were being consumed by fires their crews couldn't extinguish. Admiral Nagumo stood on Akagi's bridge, watching his flagship burn before being physically forced to transfer his flag to a cruiser. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, operating separated from the main force, launched a counterstrike that crippled Yorktown. But that afternoon, American dive bombers from Enterprise found Hiryu and delivered the same treatment: 4 bomb hits, uncontrollable fires. By evening, all 4 Japanese carriers were abandoned and sinking or burning. The Kido Butai had been destroyed in a single day. The Battle of Midway lasted 3 days, but the decisive action consumed 5 minutes. In those 5 minutes, the course of the Pacific War changed irreversibly. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, 248 aircraft, and most critically, over 100 of her most experienced pilots and aircrew. These were men who had trained for years, who had combat experience dating back to the war in China, who represented the institutional knowledge of carrier warfare that Japan had spent 2 decades developing. The loss of the ships was devastating, but potentially replaceable. Japan's shipyards could build new carriers, though not at American speed. The loss of the aircrews was catastrophic and irreplaceable. The Japanese naval aviation training system, designed for quality over quantity, could not rapidly produce new pilots with anything approaching the skill level of those lost at Midway. The veterans who died in those 4 carriers took with them knowledge, experience, and combat effectiveness that no amount of training time could replicate. American losses were significant. Yorktown sunk, 147 aircraft lost, 307 men killed. But the United States could replace these losses. More than replace them. Multiply them. By 1943, American shipyards were completing a new Essex-class fleet carrier every 2 months. By 1944, they were launching escort carriers at a rate of 1 every 5 days. American naval aviation training schools were graduating pilots by the thousands, each one receiving 300 hours of flight training before ever seeing combat. The industrial and human mathematics that Admiral Yamamoto had feared were now being written in steel and blood across the Pacific. Japan had started the war with 10 fleet carriers and light carriers. The United States had 7. By war's end, Japan would commission 7 more fleet carriers. America would commission 28 fleet carriers and 71 escort carriers. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated the complete reversal of carrier warfare dominance. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded 9 Japanese carriers with 473 aircraft. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher commanded 15 American carriers with 956 aircraft. The Japanese launched strikes that were detected by American radar 150 miles out, intercepted by hundreds of F-6F Hellcats guided to their targets by fighter directors, and massacred in what American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In 2 days, Japan lost 645 aircraft and 3 carriers. American losses, 123 aircraft and no ships. The battle wasn't even close. Japanese naval aviation had been reduced from an elite force to cannon fodder for American pilots, who now had the training, the technology, and the overwhelming numbers to destroy anything that opposed them. The final destruction of Japanese carrier power came at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. Admiral Ozawa commanded 4 carriers with only 116 aircraft, so few that the carriers were used as decoys to draw American forces away from the main battle. The ruse worked tactically. American carriers pursued and sank all 4 Japanese carriers. But strategically, it was meaningless. Japan no longer had the pilots, the fuel, or the aircraft to operate carriers effectively. The ships were empty shells, useful only as bait. By 1945, American carrier task forces operated with impunity off the Japanese coast. Task Force 58, commanded by Admiral Mitcher, included 16 fleet carriers and operated as a mobile air force that could strike anywhere along the Japanese archipelago. In July 1945, American carriers launched 1,747 sorties in a single day against targets around Tokyo. Japanese opposition was negligible. The fighters that rose to meet them were flown by pilots with 40 hours of training, sacrificial pawns against pilots with 300 hours of training and years of combat experience. The doctrine that Japan had perfected, the concentration of carrier power that had seemed invincible in 1942, now worked against them. American carriers operated in task groups of 4 or 5 ships, mutually supporting, their air groups coordinated by radio and radar. Japanese defenders faced not individual raids, but waves of aircraft that kept coming, hour after hour, day after day, until resistance simply ceased. The admirals who had laughed at American carriers in 1941 were dead, missing, or in positions where they could only watch helplessly as the weapon they had mastered destroyed them. Admiral Nagumo committed suicide on Saipan in July 1944 as American forces overran the island. Admiral Yamaguchi, the aggressive carrier commander, had gone down with Hiryu at Midway. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of carrier warfare, had been killed in April 1943 when American P-38 fighters, guided by decoded intelligence, shot down his aircraft over Bougainville. The carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor met similar fates. Akagi, scuttled by Japanese destroyers after Midway. Kaga, sunk by dive bombers at Midway. Soryu, torpedoed by an American submarine while sinking after Midway. Hiryu, scuttled by her crew after Midway. Shokaku, torpedoed by USS Kavala in the Philippine Sea. Zuikaku, sunk by carrier aircraft at Cape Engano during Leyte Gulf. The 6 carriers that had seemed invincible in December 1941 were all at the bottom of the Pacific by October 1944. They had taken with them the illusion of Japanese naval supremacy and the arrogance that had blinded Japanese strategists to the reality of American industrial power. The transformation of American carrier doctrine between 1941 and 1945 represented one of the most complete military evolutions in modern warfare. The US Navy that entered the war with carriers as auxiliaries to the battle fleet emerged with carriers as the capital ships, with battleships relegated to escort and bombardment roles. The Fast Carrier Task Force became the dominant weapons system in the Pacific, capable of projecting power across thousands of miles, sustaining operations for months, and overwhelming any opposition through sheer weight of numbers and quality of equipment. This transformation was enabled by American industrial capacity that Japanese planners had dismissed as soft, inefficient, and incapable of military excellence. The same factories that had built automobiles retooled to build aircraft. The shipyards that had built cargo vessels began launching carriers. By 1944, the United States was producing more carriers, more aircraft, more pilots, and more of everything than Japan could destroy. The mathematics Admiral Yamamoto had feared became the mathematics of defeat for the empire he served. The irony extended beyond simple production numbers. Japanese carriers at the start of the war were in many ways superior designs. Better damage control, better aircraft, better trained crews. But American carriers incorporated lessons from early losses, improved damage control systems, better firefighting equipment, enhanced armor protection around vital spaces. When USS Franklin was struck by 2 bombs off Japan in March 1945, suffering casualties of 724 dead and 265 wounded, she survived. A similar hit on a Japanese carrier would have resulted in the ship's loss. American carrier aircraft evolved at a pace that left Japanese aviation behind. The F-4F Wildcat of 1942, inferior to the Zero in almost every respect, gave way to the F-6F Hellcat in 1943, which dominated the Zero. By 1945, the F-4U Corsair and F-8F Bearcat were generations ahead of anything Japan could produce. American dive bombers and torpedo bombers improved similarly, with the TBF Avenger replacing the obsolete TBD Devastator, creating a weapon system that Japanese carriers couldn't defend against. The radar advantage proved decisive in carrier warfare. American carriers could detect incoming raids at 100 miles, vector fighters to intercept, and coordinate defenses across an entire task force. Japanese carriers relied on visual spotting, giving them perhaps 5 minutes of warning before attack. This technological gap, more than any other single factor, determined the outcome of carrier battles after 1942. The human element remained crucial. American pilot training programs, initially producing pilots with less skill than their Japanese counterparts, evolved to emphasize tactics, teamwork, and systems operation over individual dogfighting prowess. The Thatch Weave, a defensive maneuver developed by Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, allowed American fighters to counter the Zero's superior maneuverability through coordinated tactics. American pilots learned to use their aircraft's strengths, speed and firepower, while avoiding turning dogfights that favored the Zero. Japanese pilot quality declined catastrophically after Midway. The loss of experienced aircrews at Midway, the Philippine Sea, and dozens of smaller engagements created a spiral of decreasing effectiveness. New pilots, rushed through abbreviated training programs, lasted only hours in combat. Their losses created more demand for replacements, further shortening training, creating pilots even less prepared for combat. By 1945, Japanese naval aviation existed only as kamikaze units, pilots with so little training that they could barely take off and navigate to a target, much less engage in combat. The transformation of carrier warfare between 1941 and 1945 established principles that govern naval aviation to this day. Carriers are the capital ships of modern navies. Air superiority, not gun range, determines naval supremacy. Intelligence and technology can overcome tactical skill. Industrial capacity enables sustained operations. These lessons, written in the wreckage of Japanese carriers across the Pacific, shaped how nations have approached naval warfare for 8 decades. They called them floating airfields, clumsy, vulnerable, experimental platforms that could never match the hitting power of a battleship's guns or the romantic appeal of surface warfare. Japanese admirals had laughed at American carriers, dismissing them as expensive toys that would be swept aside when serious naval power confronted them. That laughter echoed across the Pacific in December 1941 as the Kido Butai demonstrated what carrier warfare could achieve. The laughter stopped at Midway. In 5 minutes on June 4, 1942, American dive bombers proved that carriers weren't auxiliary vessels, but devastating weapons that could change the course of history in minutes. The admirals who had perfected carrier warfare, who had struck Pearl Harbor with seemingly invincible force, watched their doctrine, their fleet, and their empire burn under attacks launched from the floating airfields they had once mocked. By 1945, the sky over Japan was filled with American carrier aircraft, waves of bombers and fighters launched from task forces that operated with complete impunity. The 6 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor were gone, along with every other carrier Japan had possessed or built during the war. In their place, American carriers numbered in the dozens, each one a testament to industrial might that Japanese planners had dismissed as weakness. The ocean had changed its masters. The nation that had perfected the weapon of carrier warfare had been destroyed by it, overwhelmed by an enemy who had learned faster, adapted better, and produced more than Japanese strategists thought possible. The floating airfields had become the most powerful weapons in naval warfare, and by the time Japan's admirals understood what was coming, it was already too late. The age of the battleship had ended, the era of air power had begun, and the laughter had turned to silence, broken only by the sound of American aircraft filling the sky over a defeated empire.